The air in the Capitol was thick with the hum of conversations and the steady clatter of hurried footsteps echoing through the marble halls. The towering pillars, gleaming with the polish of history, seemed to lean in, listening to the whispered plans and whispered fears of the nation's leaders. Pam Bondi, the United States Attorney General under President Donald Trump, strode confidently down the hall, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floors. She held her head high, her piercing blue eyes scanning the bustling scene before her. Bondi was a force to be reckoned with, sharp, unyielding, and fiercely loyal to the American people. Today was an important day. She had been summoned to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee regarding a crucial national security matter. It was supposed to be a routine hearing, a straightforward review of the administration's progress in cracking down on international cyber threats. But as Bondi entered the chamber, she noticed an unusual tension in the air. Senators sat a bit straighter, staffers whispered a bit more urgently, and the press gallery was packed to the rafters. As she approached the witness stand, Bondi's sharp instincts warned her that something was amiss. She adjusted her crisp navy blazer and settled into her chair, her fingers lacing together on the polished wooden surface before her. She took a deep breath, letting her gaze sweep over the faces of the senators seated in a semicircle before her. At the far end of the panel, she spotted him, Cory Booker, the New Jersey senator with a reputation for fiery speeches and dramatic, impassioned questioning. Booker, known for his relentless criticism of the Trump administration, leaned back in his chair with a faint, knowing smirk. His eyes were fixed on Bondi as if he had been waiting for this moment. Bondi felt a slight tightening in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. She had faced tough opponents before, and Booker was just another ambitious politician trying to make his mark. She knew his tactics well: push hard, get a headline, stir up controversy. But she also knew something else. She was ready for this. The gavel came down, a sharp crack that silenced the room. Senator Chuck Grassley, the committee chair, leaned into his microphone. "The Judiciary Committee will come to order," he intoned, his voice gravelly but firm. "Today we welcome the Honorable Pam Bondi, the United States Attorney General, to discuss ongoing efforts to protect our nation's cybersecurity and the rule of law." Bondi straightened in her seat, her gaze steady as Grassley continued the formalities. She had prepared meticulously for this hearing, her briefing books filled with facts, figures, and bulletproof talking points. She was ready for policy debates, statistical deep dives, and sharp questions. But as soon as Grassley opened the floor to questioning, it became clear that this was not going to be a standard hearing. Booker leaned forward, his fingers steepled as he activated his microphone. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," he began, his voice smooth but edged with a hint of challenge. "Attorney General Bondi, I have a few questions for you. I hope you're prepared for some straightforward, no-nonsense discussion today." Bondi's jaw tightened, but she forced a polite smile. "Of course, Senator Booker. I always welcome a straightforward discussion." Booker's eyes narrowed and he leaned even closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper that echoed ominously through the microphones. "Good," he said, his gaze locking with Bondi's. "Because today, the American people deserve the truth." Bondi felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She had seen this play before. Booker was setting the stage for something big, something dramatic. She squared her shoulders, ready for whatever came next. The room fell into a tense silence as Booker adjusted his microphone, leaning in like a lion preparing to pounce. The cameras zoomed in, catching the determined set of his jaw and the slight twitch of his brow. He was clearly preparing for a dramatic confrontation, and the journalists in the press gallery leaned forward, fingers hovering over their keyboards ready to capture the moment. "Attorney General Bondi," Booker began, his tone sharp and calculated, "I'd like to ask you about the administration's so-called tough stance on crime and corruption. You've been a vocal supporter of President Trump's law and order approach, but I want to know, how do you justify your support when this administration has repeatedly undermined the very rule of law you claim to defend?" Bondi raised an eyebrow, surprised at how quickly Booker had moved to an attack. He wasn't easing into this confrontation, he was diving in headfirst, aiming straight for the heart of the administration's credibility. She let the moment hang for a second, giving him just enough rope to reveal his true intentions. "Senator Booker," she replied, her voice calm but firm, "I appreciate the question, but let's be clear. My role as Attorney General is to uphold the laws of this nation without fear or favor. That includes prosecuting those who break the law regardless of their political affiliation or influence. If you have specific examples you'd like to discuss, I'm more than happy to address them." Booker leaned back slightly, a small, satisfied grin crossing his face. He had expected her to respond with a standard defense, and she had taken the bait. Now he was ready to spring his trap. Well, let's start with the January 6th Capitol incident, he said, his tone growing sharper. The whole world watched as violent rioters stormed this very building, threatening the very democracy we all swore to protect. Yet your office has been criticized for being selective in its prosecution, pursuing some cases aggressively while seeming to protect others. Can you explain this apparent double standard, Attorney General Bondi? The room tensed. It was a loaded question designed to frame Bondi as an enabler of chaos and a protector of political allies. Several senators on the committee shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the intensity of the moment. The press gallery buzzed quietly as journalists quickly typed out the unfolding drama. Bondi took a slow, measured breath. She could feel the pressure of 1,000 lenses and 1,000,000 eyes watching, waiting to see if she would falter. But she had been in the political arena for years, and she had faced down tougher challenges than this. Senator Booker, she said, locking eyes with him, I appreciate your passion on this issue, but I reject the premise of your question. My office has been nothing but consistent in pursuing justice, regardless of the political affiliations of those involved. We have charged and prosecuted over 700 individuals for their roles in that incident, and we continue to investigate hundreds more. I will not allow you to paint this administration as one that picks and chooses when to uphold the law based on politics. That's simply not true. Booker's grin faded slightly, but he wasn't done yet. He leaned forward, his voice growing more intense. But what about those who encouraged this violence? What about those in the administration who fanned the flames of division and chaos? Are you telling me that your office has no intention of holding them accountable? Are you, Attorney General Bondi, willing to look the other way while your political allies evade justice? Bondi felt a flicker of irritation, but she suppressed it. She had anticipated this line of attack, and she was ready to turn it back on Booker with a force that would leave the senator speechless. Senator, she said, her voice cool and sharp, if you're accusing me or this administration of protecting criminals, then I suggest you present your evidence. But until then, I will not be lectured by someone who has a long history of selective outrage and political grandstanding. A ripple of surprise swept through the room. Bondi had just turned the attack back on Booker, challenging him to back up his claims or step aside. She could see the surprise flash across his face, and for the first time in the hearing, his confident demeanor cracked. The cameras clicked rapidly, capturing the moment as Bondi leaned in, her eyes locked on Booker's. You want to talk about accountability, Senator? Let's do that. But first, let's make sure we're being honest about who really undermines the rule of law in this country. The room seemed to hold its breath as Bondi's words hung in the air. Booker's confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped frown. He shifted in his seat, clearly unprepared for the sudden shift in the power dynamic. He had expected Bondi to play defense, to scramble for words as he cornered her with pointed questions. Instead, she had flipped the script, putting him on his heels. Bondi leaned back slightly, her eyes never leaving Booker's. She felt the tension in the room shift in her favor, the silent acknowledgement that she had just seized control of the hearing. She decided to press her advantage. Senator Booker, she continued, her tone cool but edged with a steely resolve, you brought up the events of January 6th, so let's address that directly. As I said, my office has aggressively pursued those responsible for the violence that day. But let me ask you this, where was this same outrage from you when American cities were burning for months on end in 2020? A low murmur swept through the chamber. Bondi's words had landed like a thunderclap, catching even some of her supporters by surprise. Booker's face darkened, his jaw tightening as he realized where this line of questioning was headed. During the summer of 2020, Bondi continued, her voice gaining momentum, we saw violent riots in cities across this country. Portland, Seattle, Minneapolis, where entire neighborhoods were set ablaze, businesses destroyed, and lives ruined. Yet, many in this chamber remained silent or even praised those actions as mostly peaceful protests. You, Senator Booker, publicly defended these uprisings, calling them a necessary expression of anger. So I ask you, where was your commitment to law and order then? Booker opened his mouth to respond, but Bondi didn't give him the chance. She had the momentum now, and she wasn't about to let him wrestle it back. You talk about holding people accountable, Senator, but accountability must be consistent. It can't just apply to the political opponents you want to take down while ignoring the violence from those you support. That's not justice. That's selective enforcement, and the American people see right through it. The room fell into a stunned silence. Several senators exchanged nervous glances, and the press gallery erupted in a flurry of whispers and rapid typing. This was not the script they had expected. Bondi had taken the fight directly to Booker, exposing the double standard that had plagued the national debate for years. Booker shifted in his seat, clearly struggling to regain his footing. His face flushed slightly as he leaned into his microphone, his voice strained but defiant. Attorney General Bondi, you can try to deflect all you want, but the fact remains that this administration has consistently undermined the rule of law, he shot back. You talk about riots, but what about the blatant attempts to overturn the 2020 election? What about the pressure campaigns on state officials? Are you willing to address those actions, or will you continue to hide behind deflections and whataboutism? Bondi felt a spark of anger flare in her chest, but she kept her voice steady, refusing to let Booker see that he had struck a nerve. Senator, she said, leaning forward, her eyes narrowing, if you want to talk about undermining the rule of law, let's talk about the years of baseless investigations, politically motivated impeachments, and the relentless attacks on a sitting president simply because you didn't like the results of an election. The American people are tired of this double standard. They see through it, and they deserve better from their leaders. A few scattered claps broke out from the Republican side of the chamber, quickly silenced by the gavel as Senator Grassley sought to regain control of the hearing. But the damage had been done. Bondi had seized control of the narrative, turning Booker's trap into a platform for a scathing indictment of his own record. Bondi straightened in her seat, a hint of a smile touching her lips as she watched Booker struggle to mask his frustration. She had come prepared for a fight, and she had just landed the first major blow. The tension in the chamber crackled like a live wire, every eye fixed on the two figures at the center of the confrontation. Pam Bondi, with her unflinching gaze and poised demeanor, had just flipped the script on Cory Booker, forcing him onto the defensive. But she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. As Booker fumbled for a response, Bondi seized the moment, leaning into her microphone with the precision of a veteran prosecutor moving in for the final strike. Senator Booker, she said, her voice steady but cutting, you speak passionately about defending democracy and the rule of law, but perhaps you should take a moment to reflect on your own record. You accuse this administration of undermining the integrity of our institutions, but let's talk about the tactics you and your colleagues have used to disrupt the very foundation of our justice system. Booker's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he realized that Bondi had no intention of letting him regain control. During the confirmation hearings for Justice Brett Kavanaugh, Bondi continued, you famously declared yourself Spartacus as you violated Senate rules by releasing confidential documents, grandstanding for the cameras in a blatant attempt to sabotage a Supreme Court nomination. You claimed you were making a stand for transparency, but the documents you released had already been cleared for public viewing. It was a stunt, Senator, a political theater act designed to score cheap points with your base. And you have the nerve to lecture me about the rule of law? The room erupted in a chorus of sharp intakes of breath, and several senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Booker's face flushed with a deep, angry red, and he leaned into his microphone, his hands gripping the table's edge. Attorney General Bondi, he shot back, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed anger, this isn't about me. This is about your administration's blatant disregard for the Constitution, your willingness to protect corrupt allies, and your efforts to undermine democratic norms. Bondi held up a hand, cutting him off before he could gain any momentum. Let's talk about norms, Senator, she said sharply. Let's talk about how you and your colleagues spent years promoting a false narrative of collusion, wasting taxpayer dollars on a politically motivated investigation that failed to produce a single piece of evidence supporting your claims. You talk about defending democracy, but you've done more to undermine public trust in our institutions than anyone sitting at this table. Booker opened his mouth to respond, but Bondi wasn't finished. She leaned in closer, her eyes locking onto his, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet tone. And let's not forget your own financial connections to major tech corporations, the same companies that have censored conservative voices and manipulated the flow of information to influence public opinion. The American people are smart, Senator. They see the hypocrisy and they are tired of it. The room fell into a stunned silence. Even some of Booker's Democratic colleagues sat back in their chairs, clearly caught off guard by the ferocity of Bondi's counterattack. Cameras clicked rapidly, capturing the rare sight of a usually confident Booker momentarily speechless. Bondi leaned back, letting the silence linger, her gaze never leaving Booker's flushed face. She had prepared for this moment, knowing that her opponent would come armed with soundbites and talking points. But she had come armed with the truth, and in that moment, it felt like the only weapon that truly mattered. Grassley's gavel came down sharply, the crack echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. "Order," the senator barked, his voice strained as he tried to regain control. "The committee will come to order." Bondi folded her hands neatly in front of her, her expression calm, her breathing steady. She had delivered her blows, and from the looks on the faces around her, they had landed exactly where she intended. Booker, his face still flushed with anger, leaned back, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and embarrassment. He had come to this hearing prepared for a fight, but he had clearly underestimated the woman sitting across from him. For the first time in the hearing, it felt like the tide had shifted decisively in Bondi's favor. And as the cameras zoomed in on her resolute expression, it was clear that she wasn't finished yet. The air in the chamber felt heavier now, charged with the silent anticipation of a crowd sensing the climax of a high-stakes confrontation. Cory Booker's face was a mask of strained composure, his jaw clenched tight, eyes narrowed as he struggled to recover from Bondi's devastating counterattack. Pam Bondi, however, remained calm, her icy blue eyes locked on her opponent, her expression one of unshakable confidence. She had Booker cornered, and she wasn't about to let him off the hook. "Senator Booker," she began, her voice smooth but with a hard edge, "you speak of protecting democracy and defending the Constitution, but let's be clear, your actions have repeatedly undermined those very principles. You have supported the censorship of political speech, championed the erosion of due process, and used your position to silence those with whom you disagree. That's not democracy. That's tyranny." The room fell into a stunned silence. Even some of Booker's closest allies on the panel looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the brutal honesty of Bondi's words. She could see the shifting expressions around the table. Some eyes narrowed in anger, others widened in shock. But what mattered most was the look on Booker's face, a mixture of disbelief and simmering fury. Before he could recover, Bondi leaned in, her voice dropping to a near whisper that cut through the silence like a blade. "And let's not forget, Senator," she continued, "that while you lecture this administration on ethics and integrity, you have repeatedly turned a blind eye to the corruption within your own ranks. You've defended mayors, governors, and political allies who have been caught in scandal after scandal, all while pretending to hold the moral high ground. The American people are not fooled. They see the hypocrisy, and they will remember it." Booker's face flushed a deep, angry red, his fists clenching on the table before him. He opened his mouth to respond, but Bondi raised a hand, cutting him off with a cool, dismissive smile. "But I understand why you're upset, Senator," she said, leaning back slightly. "You're not used to being challenged. You're not used to someone pushing back against your political grandstanding. But that's exactly what I'm here to do, hold people accountable regardless of their party or position." The room was utterly silent now, the tension so thick it felt like the very walls of the Capitol were leaning in to listen. Cameras clicked furiously as reporters in the press gallery frantically typed out the stunning turn of events. Finally, Bondi sat back, folding her hands neatly in front of her, her eyes never leaving Booker's. She had made her point. She had exposed the double standards, the political games, and the selective outrage that had become so common in Washington. And as the seconds ticked by, it became clear that Booker had no comeback, no prepared speech to counter the devastating blows he had just taken. Senator Grassley, sensing that the moment had passed, brought his gavel down sharply, the crack echoing through the chamber like a final, decisive punctuation mark on the confrontation. "Thank you, Attorney General Bondi," he said, his voice steady but tinged with a hint of respect. "The committee will now move on to the next line of questioning." Bondi nodded politely, adjusting her blazer as she prepared for the next round. But in her mind, the battle had already been won. She had stood her ground, defended her principles, and exposed the hypocrisy of her most vocal critic. As the cameras continued to click and the whispers filled the chamber, one thing was clear: Pam Bondi had just delivered a political masterclass, and the entire nation had just witnessed it.